Hello everyone and welcome back to SD Geek. Today I have an airport update on Seattle Tacoma International Airport, located in the city of Seattle in Washington. Hope you enjoy today's update and let's get started. So this airport features 6 concourses: Concourse A, B, C, D, the South Satellite, and the North Satellite. So we're going to be starting off at Concourse A. So here to start off the airport update, we have this United Boeing 757-200. This aircraft will be headed to Chicago O'Hare in Illinois as Flight 747. Next up here is this United Boeing 757-200. This aircraft will be headed to Denver in Colorado as Flight 1483. Next up here is this United Boeing 757-200. This aircraft will be headed to Houston in Texas as Flight 1788. And next up here we have the first international route of the video. This is a WestJet Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Calgary in Canada as Flight 1551. And right next to that we have this United Boeing 757-200. This aircraft will be headed to Los Angeles in California as Flight 2397. And following that we have this United Boeing 757-200. This aircraft will be headed to Newark in New Jersey as Flight 702. And right next to that we have this United Boeing 757-200 headed to San Francisco in California as Flight 737. Right next to that we have this United Boeing 757-200. This aircraft will be headed to Washington Dulles as Flight 2275. And right next to that here is this Spirit Airbus A320 headed to Las Vegas in Nevada as Flight 872. And following that is this Spirit Airbus A320. This aircraft will be headed to Los Angeles in California as Flight 357. Alright, and then here we have this Delta Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to San Jose del Cabo in Mexico as Flight 1914. And right next to that here is this Delta Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Puerto Vallarta in Mexico as Flight 1921. Here, wrapping up Concourse A, we have this Delta Boeing 737-800 headed to Cancun in Mexico as Flight 594. And here, starting off Concourse B, we have this Southwest Boeing 737-800 headed to Chicago Midway in Illinois as Flight 3296. And following that is this Southwest Boeing 737-800 headed to Denver in Colorado as Flight 3902. And here following that we have this Southwest Boeing 737-800 headed to Las Vegas in Nevada as Flight 3027. Right next to that is this Southwest 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to St. Louis in Missouri as Flight 3910. And here we have this Frontier Airbus A321. This aircraft will be headed to Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas as Flight 4065. And here we have this Frontier Airbus A321. This aircraft will be headed to Denver in Colorado as Flight 405. Right next to that we have this Delta Boeing 737-800 headed to Anchorage in Alaska as Flight 922. And right next to that is this Delta Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Chicago O'Hare in Illinois as Flight 2055. Here following that we have this Delta Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Las Vegas in Nevada as Flight 2880. And right next to that here we have this Delta Boeing 737-800 headed to Los Angeles in California as Flight 2640. Next to that we have this Delta Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Phoenix in Arizona as Flight 2447. Next up here we have this Delta Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to San Diego in California as Flight 2533. Right next to that here is this Delta Boeing 737-800 headed to Tampa in Florida as Flight 1090. Here we have this Delta Boeing 737-800 headed to Atlanta in Georgia as Flight 307. Following that is this Delta Boeing 737-800 headed to Salt Lake City in Utah as Flight 2817. And here, wrapping up Concourse B, we have this Delta Boeing 737-800 headed to San Francisco in California as Flight 1591. Like I said, that does wrap up Concourse B. Next, we'll move on to Concourse C, which just has Alaska right now. So starting off Concourse C, We have this Alaska Boeing 737-800 headed to Las Vegas in Nevada as flight 688. And moving on, we have this Alaska 737-800 headed to Lihue in Hawaii as flight 839. And if you're wondering why there are no jet bridges, this is the regional section of this concourse, so there won't be any jet bridges in this section. But the last 6 gates of Concourse C will have jet bridges. Following that, here is this Alaska Boeing 737-800 headed to Nashville in Tennessee as flight 382. Here's this Alaska Boeing 737-800. Once again, this aircraft will be headed to Portland in Oregon as flight 956. Following that, we have this Alaska Boeing 737-800 headed to Los Angeles in California as flight 1092. And right next to that, we have this Alaska Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Orlando in Florida as flight 346. And right next to that here is this Alaska Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Phoenix in Arizona as flight 640. Next to that here is this Alaska Boeing 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Sacramento in California as flight 600. And right next to that here is this Alaska 737-800. This aircraft will be headed off to Washington Reagan as flight 2. Right next to that here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to St. Louis in Missouri as flight 472. Here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Spokane in Washington as flight 962. And following that, we have this Alaska 737-800 headed to Fort Myers in Florida as flight 1453. Following that, here we have this Alaska 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Santa Barbara in California as flight 1138. Here, wrapping up Concourse C, we have this Alaska 737-800. He's going to be headed to Santa Ana in California as flight 1202. Like I said, that does wrap up Concourse C. Next, we'll move on to Concourse D, and yeah. So here, starting off Concourse D, we have this Alaska 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Toronto in Canada as flight 972. Following that is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Washington Dulles as flight 348. Here's this Alaska 737-800 headed to San Francisco in California as flight 1140. And here's this Alaska 737-800. He's going to be headed to San Jose in California as flight 1084. And here we have this American Airlines Boeing 777-200. This aircraft will be headed to Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas as flight 2101. We have another American 777-200. This aircraft will be headed to Charlotte in North Carolina as flight 2107. Following that, we have this American 777-200. This aircraft will be headed to Miami in Florida as flight 305. And here, wrapping up Concourse D, is this American 777-200. This aircraft will be headed to Chicago O'Hare in Illinois as flight 2368. Like I said, that does wrap up Concourse D. Next, we'll move on to the North Satellite. Starting off with the North Satellite, we have this Alaska 737-800 headed to Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas as flight 372. Following that, here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Denver in Colorado as flight 599. Next up here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Eugene in Oregon as flight 1042. Here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Fairbanks in Alaska as flight 97. And next up here is this Alaska 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Fort Lauderdale in Florida as flight 516. Here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Maui in Hawaii as flight 805. And right next to that, we have another Alaska 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Kansas City as flight 564. Here we have this Alaska 737-800 headed to Kona in Hawaii as flight 801. Next up here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Los Angeles in California as flight 1050. Here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Indianapolis in Indiana as flight 362. Here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Houston in Texas as flight 422. Next up here is this Alaska 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Honolulu in Hawaii as flight 853. Here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Fresno in California as flight 1038. And here we have this Alaska 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Detroit in Michigan as flight 9485. Here we have this Alaska 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to Columbus in Ohio as flight 562. Here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Burbank in California as flight 736. Here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Bozeman in Montana as flight 557. Here is this Alaska 737-800 headed to Boston in Massachusetts as flight 460. Finally, wrapping up Concourse N, we have an Alaska 737-800 headed to Austin in Texas as flight 594. Like I said, that does wrap up Concourse N. Next, we'll move on to Concourse S, which is known as the South Satellite and is the International Terminal of Seattle. Alright, so starting off the South Satellite, we have this British Airways Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner. This aircraft will be headed to London Heathrow in England as flight 48. Next up here is this Air Canada Boeing 777-200LR headed to Montreal in Canada as flight 514. Next up here is this Lufthansa Airbus A350-900 headed to Munich in Germany as flight 489. Next to that here is this Delta Airbus A350-900. He's going to be headed to Amsterdam in the Netherlands as flight 144. Following that here is this Virgin Atlantic Airbus A350-1000 headed to London Heathrow in England as flight 106. And here is this Delta Airbus A350-900. Once again, this one will be headed to Paris Charles de Gaulle in France as flight 80. Next to that is this Hainan Airlines Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner headed to Chongqing in China as flight 446. Next up here is this Air Tahiti Nui Boeing 787-9 Dreamliner headed to Papeete in Tahiti as flight 57. Next up here we have the first out of 2 domestic flights at the international terminal right now. So this is a JetBlue Airbus A320 headed to Boston in Massachusetts as flight 6398. For the second one here, we have this Hawaiian A330-200 operating flight 21 to Honolulu in Hawaii. Following that, operating flight 69 to Taipei in Taiwan, we have this Delta A350-900. And here, wrapping up the South Satellite, we have this Delta Airbus A350-900. Once again, this aircraft will be headed to Shanghai Pudong in China as flight 281. Like I said, that does wrap up the S satellite. Next, we'll move on to the cargo terminal. Alright, so here, starting off the cargo terminal, we have this FedEx Boeing 777 freighter. This aircraft will be headed to Anchorage in Alaska as flight 6011. And following that here is this FedEx Boeing 777F. This aircraft will be headed to Memphis in Tennessee as flight 637. And here we have this FedEx Boeing 777F headed to Oakland in California as flight 1838. Alright, so next up here I'm going to be using this UPS 747-400 as a cargo lux to make it more realistic. So here we have this cargo lux Boeing 747-400 freighter headed to Calgary in Canada as flight 6292. Following that is this Cargo Lux 747-400 freighter headed to Luxembourg as flight 6294. Here, wrapping up the cargo section, we have this Cargo Lux 747-400 freighter headed to Prestwick in Scotland as flight 6297. Like I said, that does wrap up the cargo section. Next, we'll move on to the planes taxiing around. Alright, so starting off here we have this Alaska Boeing 737-800 headed to San Diego in California as flight 1098. Next up here, right behind that, is an Alaska 737-800. This one will be headed to New York JFK as flight 16. Behind that here is this Southwest 737-800. This aircraft will be headed to San Jose in California as flight 2568. And here, arriving in, is this Hainan Airlines Boeing 787-9 coming in from Boston as flight 730. And he's going to be continuing on to Beijing in China as flight 496. And here we have this lineup of arrivals. On the top there is an Alaska 737-800 coming in from Albuquerque in New Mexico as flight 618, and we'll be continuing on to Minneapolis in Minnesota as flight 367. And then in the middle there is a Delta A350-900 headed to London Heathrow as flight 20, and he just arrived in from Tokyo Haneda in Japan as flight 166. And on the bottom here is this Japan Airlines Boeing 787-8. He's just arrived in from Tokyo Narita in Japan as flight 68 and will be headed to Tokyo Narita as flight 67. And that does conclude this airport update of Seattle Tacoma International Airport. I hope you enjoyed, because I personally enjoyed making this airport. And please comment below what airport you want me to do next, because I'm running out of ideas. So yeah, thanks for watching.